The ship was quiet during the rest cycle, the kind of quiet that made the hum of the engines sound like a lullaby, and the lights along the corridors of the verdant cradle had dimmed to a soft amber glow that mimicked the evening sky of a world most of the passengers had never seen. Lieutenant Asha Moran walked through the corridor of the family deck, with her boots making soft sounds against the warm floor, and her hair was dripping wet, sending small drops of water onto the composite panels beneath her feet like tiny rain on a metal field. She had just taken a shower, nothing more and nothing less, and she was thinking about coffee and whether the galley still had any of the good kind left from the last supply run. And she was also thinking about how her shoulders hurt from the tension she had been carrying all week, because being the only human on a ship full of Marathi was a strange and sometimes lonely thing. The Marathi were beautiful in the way that cats back on Earth were beautiful. If cats stood on two legs and had golden eyes the size of small moons, and spoke in voices that sounded like velvet dragged across warm stone, and they had fur that ranged from deep silver to burnt orange, and retractable claws that clicked against surfaces when they were nervous or excited, and long tails that curled and uncurled depending on their mood. They were also deeply and completely terrified of water. Asha had learned this in her first week aboard the ship, when she had accidentally spilled a cup of water near a group of Marathi officers, and they had jumped back as if she had dropped a live grenade, and their ears had flattened against their skulls, and their claws had extended, and one of them had actually hissed, and Asha had stood there holding her empty cup and wondering what in the world she had done wrong. She had later read the cultural file and learned about the Ketvol, the ancient water predators of the Marathi homeworld, serpentine creatures that had lived in the river deltas and had hunted the ancestors of the Marathi for thousands of years, dragging them beneath the surface and into the dark. And the fear of water had been bred into them so deeply that even now, generations after leaving their homeworld, Marathi children were taught to fear open water before they could walk. Asha understood it the way a person understands a fact without truly feeling it, the way someone might understand that another person is afraid of heights while standing comfortably on a balcony and wondering what the fuss is about. She toweled her hair as she walked, squeezing the water out of the dark strands and letting it fall wherever it wanted to fall, because she was tired and it was the rest cycle, and she did not think anyone was watching. But someone was watching. In the play nook just off the main corridor, a group of 5 Marathi cubs were huddled together behind a low barrier of cushions and soft mats, and they had been in the middle of a game that involved stacking small glowing blocks into towers when the sound of Asha's boots had drawn their attention. The eldest among them was a cub named Risen, who had silver-gray fur and sharp golden eyes, and the kind of serious expression that made adults smile, because it looked so important on such a small face. And Risen was the first to see the water. He saw it dripping from the human's head, running down the dark strands of whatever that stuff was that humans had instead of fur, and it was falling onto the floor in fat drops that caught the amber light and shimmered. And his ears went flat against his skull, and his tail curled tight around his own ankle. "Look," he whispered to the others, and his voice was barely a breath. The other cubs looked, and one by one their eyes went wide, and their ears folded back, and their small bodies pressed closer together in the instinctive huddle that Marathi cubs had been doing since the beginning of their species, when danger was near. "She is wet," said a cub named Porath, who had orange fur and a missing tooth, and a habit of stating the obvious in the most alarmed way possible. "She is very wet," agreed another cub named Della, who was Porath's twin, and who always agreed with him about everything. "She came from the water place," whispered Risen, and there was something in his voice that was not just fear, but something bigger than fear, something that lived on the other side of terror, where awe begins. The youngest cub was named Tavi, and she was small even for her age, with fur the color of warm sand, and enormous amber eyes that seemed to take up half her face, and she was gripping Rissen's arms so tightly that her tiny claws were leaving marks, and she was staring at Asha with her mouth slightly open. "Did she go in the water?" Tavi asked, and the question came out like a prayer, spoken in a temple. Rissen watched Asha walk to the galley entrance and disappear inside without any sign of pain or fear or injury. And he watched the small trail of water drops she left behind on the floor, like evidence of something impossible. And his young mind turned the scene over and over, the way a cub turns a strange stone in its paws. The stories said that no one came back from the water, that the HFY took everything, that the river swallowed and never returned. And yet here was this human, walking calmly through the corridor, with water streaming from her body, as if it were nothing, as if she had gone into the deep place where the ancient beasts live, and had simply decided to come back. "She fought one," Rissen said, and his voice was steady now, steady the way a cub's voice gets when he has decided something and will not be moved from it. "Fought what?" asked Porath. "A water beast," said Rissen, and the words hung in the air like smoke, and every cub in the nook went perfectly. "She went into the water, and she fought a HFY, and she won," Rissen continued, and his golden eyes were bright and certain. "And that is why she is not afraid, and that is why she has no fur to protect her, because she does not need it, because she is stronger than the water, and stronger than anything that lives in it." Tavi made a small sound in her throat, the sound that Marathi cubs make when they hear something that changes the shape of the world inside their heads. "She came back," Tavi whispered, and the wonder in her voice was so big and so pure that it filled the entire playnook like light fills a room when someone opens a window. In the galley, Asha found the good coffee and poured herself a cup and took a long sip and sighed the kind of sigh that a tired person sighs when something small goes right at the end of a long day. And she had no idea that 5 small alien children had just decided she was the greatest warrior their species had ever. She drank her coffee and went to bed, and the water on the corridor floor slowly dried and disappeared. But the story the cubs had built from it was only just beginning to grow. Over the next 2 ship days, the cubs watched Asha the way small creatures watch a thunderstorm, with their bodies pressed low and their eyes enormous, and their hearts beating so fast that they could feel it in their throats. They watched her from behind pillars and around corners and through the gaps in the play nook barrier, and they kept a careful distance because Rissen had told them that a warrior of the water must be given respect and space. And none of them wanted to be the one who angered the human who had defeated a HFY with her bare hands. And everything they saw only made the legend bigger. On the first morning of their watch, Asha walked into the communal galley and filled a glass with water from the dispenser, and she lifted it to her mouth and drank it, just like that, as if she were breathing air or blinking her eyes, and Porath nearly fell off the bench he was hiding behind because he could not believe what he was seeing. He said to Della, and his orange fur was standing on end all over his body. "She is drinking the beast," Della whispered back, and her eyes were so wide that the gold in them looked like 2 small suns. Rissen was keeping notes on a data slate that he had borrowed from the education terminal, and he wrote down everything with the serious focus of a scholar recording the deeds of a legendary hero. And his handwriting was messy because his paws were still small, and his claws kept catching on the screen. But he did not care, because this was important work. Entry 1. The human drank a full glass of water without stopping, and she did not even make a face. Entry 2. The human put her hands under running water in the wash basin, and moved her fingers around in it like she was playing with it, and she was smiling while she did it. Entry 3. The human carried a full, open container of water across the entire mess hall with one hand, and she did not spill a single drop. And her hand was not even shaking. Each entry made the cubs gasp and huddle closer together, and whisper to each other in the rapid clicking language that Marathi cubs used when they were too excited for proper words. Tavi was the most devoted watcher of them all, and she followed Asha with her enormous amber eyes, the way a flower follows the sun. And she noticed things that the other cubs missed, because she was small and quiet, and very good at paying attention. She noticed that Asha's eyes were the color of storm clouds over deep water, and she told the other cubs that she had seen those eyes change color when the water touched Asha's skin, that they went from gray to silver to something that looked like lightning trapped behind glass. And the other cubs believed her completely because Tavi was the youngest, and everyone knew that the youngest always saw things that older eyes had forgotten how to see. It was not true, of course, because Asha simply had gray eyes. That looked different depending on the light, the way all gray eyes do. But truth and legend have never been close friends, and in the world the cubs were building, there was no room for something as small as ordinary lighting. On the second day, Risen gathered the cubs in the play nook for what he called a war council, and he stood on a cushion to make himself taller, and he held up his data slate and read his entries aloud in a voice that tried very hard to be deep and commanding, but was still the voice of a child, and therefore cracked in several places. "The human is not like other beings on this ship," he declared, and the other cubs nodded solemnly. "She does not fear the water, because she has conquered it and the beasts that live within it, and we must record her deeds so that they are never forgotten." "What if she fights another one?" asked Porath, and his voice was equal parts terror and excitement. "Then we will record that too," said Risen. After the war council, that Risen began the drawing. He sat in the corner of the play nook, with his data slate flat on his knees, and he drew with the careful intensity of a cub who believed he was creating something sacred. And the image took shape slowly over the course of several hours, and the other cubs drifted in and out to watch and offer suggestions. Risen drew Asha, standing tall with her wet hair streaming behind her like a banner in the wind, and beneath her feet he drew a coiled serpent with scales like dark water and eyes like deep river stones. And the serpent was defeated and broken, and Asha was standing on top of it with one foot on its neck, and her storm-colored eyes blazing. Porath suggested adding teeth to the serpent, and Risen added many teeth, far more teeth than any real creature would have, but the cubs agreed it looked right, because a beast worthy of Asha's attention should have many teeth. Della suggested adding waves around Asha's feet. Risen added those too, great curling waves that looked like hands reaching up from the deep. Tavi did not suggest anything for a long time, and then very quietly she said, "Give her a smile." And Risen thought about this, and then drew a small, gentle smile on Asha's face. Because yes, that was right. A warrior who had defeated a water beast would smile. Not with a sharp grin of cruelty, but with the calm warmth of someone who had faced the worst thing in the world, and found that she was bigger than it. The drawing was finished by the end of the second day, and the cubs passed it around between them, and stared at it with the kind of reverence that adults reserve for holy texts and ancient relics. And then Risen copied it, and sent the copy to every cub on the family deck through the education network. By the next morning, 14 cubs had seen the drawing, and every single one of them believed it was real. Elder Mother Sanhara, the matriarch of the family deck, noticed the change in the children, the way a mother notices a change in the weather, by feeling it in her bones before she could name it. And she saw the cubs whispering and clustering and looking at their data slates with shining eyes. And she assumed it was a game because cubs were always inventing games, and games were good for them. She did not investigate further because she had many responsibilities, and the cubs seemed happy, and happiness was not something that required her intervention. This was a reasonable decision that she would later look back on with a mixture of amusement and wonder. Meanwhile, Asha continued to go about her days in complete ignorance of the mythology being constructed around her, and she drank her coffee and filed her reports and took her showers and washed her hands and carried water from one place to another. And each time she did any of these things, a small pair of golden eyes was watching from somewhere nearby, and a small paw was writing it down on a data slate. And the legend of the human who fought the water beast grew and grew in the way that legends have always grown, not through grand declarations, but through whispers and drawings, and the unshakable faith of children who had decided that the world was more wonderful than anyone had told them it was. It was Rissen's idea, of course, because all the biggest ideas came from Rissen, and he announced it at the next war council with the gravity of a general presenting a battle plan to his troops. "We must give her a tribute," he said, standing on his cushion with his tail held high and straight, which in Marathi body language meant that a decision had been made and would not be discussed further. The other cubs looked at each other and then back at Rissen, and their ears twitched in the way that Marathi ears twitch when something feels both scary and right at the same time. "A hunter's tribute?" asked Porath, and his voice dropped low on the last word, as if he were saying the name of something holy. "Yes," said Rissen. Tavi made a small chirping sound in her throat, the sound of a cub who was so excited that words had temporarily abandoned her. The hunter's tribute was one of the oldest traditions in Marathi culture, older than space travel, older than written language, older even than the cities that had once stood along the safe ridges far from the river deltas of their homeworld. And it was the highest honor that could be given to a warrior who had faced the great predators and survived. The tradition was simple but sacred. Each person who wished to honor the warrior would give their most prized possession and place it at the warrior's threshold, and the warrior would take these gifts and keep them, and in doing so would accept the love and gratitude of those who gave them. It had not been done aboard the verdant cradle in 3 generations, because there had been no great hunts and no great predators, and no reason to offer what was most precious. But Rissen knew the stories because his grandmother had told them to him before she passed, and he knew that this was what Asha deserved. The gathering of gifts took most of the day. Rissen went first, because a leader must always go first. Nook and opened the small box where he kept his treasures, and he took out a data chip that contained his entire collection of star maps, hundreds of them, maps of nebulae and galaxies and systems that he had been collecting since he was old enough to use a terminal. And each one was annotated with his own notes in his messy handwriting, and this collection was the thing he loved most in all the worlds he had mapped. He held the chip in his paw for a long moment, and felt the weight of giving something up, and then he closed his fingers around it and carried it with him, because Asha had given up her fear of the water, and that was worth more than every star map ever made. Porath brought his claw stone, a smooth, flat rock, the color of sunset that his father had polished for him on his naming day, and it fit perfectly in the center of a Marathi palm, and was warm to the touch in a way that no one could explain. And Porath had carried it everywhere for 4 years and slept with it under his head every night. Della brought a small woven bracelet that her mother had made from threads of their family's ceremonial cloth, and it was the only piece of home she had that she could touch and feel and wrap around her wrist when the ship felt too big and too cold and too far from everything she knew. The other cubs brought their own treasures, a crystal that changed color in different light, a tiny carved figure of a running Marathi, a feather from a bird that no longer existed on any world. Tavi was the last to decide, and she sat in her sleeping nook for a very long time, staring at the worn ribbon that she had pulled from her favorite blanket 2 years ago, the blanket that had been with her since she was born. and the ribbon was soft and faded and smelled like home and sleep and safety. And it was the thing she reached for in the dark when the ship made strange noises and she could not sleep. She pulled it from under her pillow and held it against her cheek one last time, and then she carried it to Risen with her chin held high and her amber eyes bright. They went together in the dimmed light of the late cycle, when the corridors were empty. 5 small cubs walking in a solemn line, with their gifts held carefully in their paws. And they moved in silence, because this was a sacred thing, and sacred things deserve silence. They found Asha's door, and they knelt before it, one at a time, and placed their gifts in a neat arrangement on the floor, with Risen's data chip in the center, and the other gifts arranged around it, in the traditional pattern that his grandmother had described, a half-circle like a rising moon. Then they stepped back and stood together, and looked at what they had done, and felt the strange lightness that comes from giving something important away. And then they crept back to their nooks and lay awake for hours, because their hearts were too full for sleep. Asha found the gifts the next morning. She nearly stepped on them as she came out of her quarters, and she stopped and looked down and saw the careful arrangement on the floor. And she bent and picked up each item one by one, and turned them over in her hands with a confused frown. She did not know what a hunter's tribute was, because the cultural file she had read was a summary, and summaries always leave out the things that matter most. And so she looked at the small pile of clearly precious objects, and her first thought was that a child had lost them, and her second thought was that she should find out whose they were. She carried them to Elder Mother Sanhara's chamber, and pressed the chime, and waited. Sanhara opened the door, and looked at Asha, and then looked at the items in her hands, and then her golden eyes went very wide and very still, in the way that Marathi eyes go when something has shocked them so deeply that their body forgets to move. "Where did you find these?" Sanhara asked. Her voice was careful in the way that a voice is careful when it is holding something fragile. "Outside my door," Asha said. "I think one of the cubs might have dropped them. I wanted to make sure they got back to whoever they belonged to." Sanhara reached out and touched the claw stone with one claw tip, and then the woven bracelet, and then the data chip. And her ears rotated slowly forward, which meant she was thinking very hard. "These were not dropped," Sanhara said. "These were placed. And they were placed in the pattern of the hunter's tribute. And that means they were given to you." "Given to me?" Asha said. "Why?" "That is what I would like to know," said Sanhara. "The hunter's tribute is the highest honor our people can offer a warrior, and it has not been given on this ship since before I was born. So I ask you, Lieutenant Moran, what have you done?" Asha searched her memory and found nothing, no great deed, no heroic act, nothing that would explain why 5 alien children would leave their most precious things at her door. "I have not done anything," she said, and she meant it completely. Sanhara looked at her for a long time, studying her face with those enormous golden eyes that seemed to see not just what was in front of them, but several layers beneath it. And something shifted in the old matriarch's expression, not understanding exactly, but something that lived in the same territory as understanding, a kind of respect for something she could not yet name. "Keep the gifts," Sanhara said finally. "I cannot take a child's treasures," Asha said. "You must," said Sanhara, and her voice was gentle but firm in the way that only a matriarch's voice can be. "To refuse a hunter's tribute is to tell the giver that their love is not worthy. And these are children, Lieutenant, and their love is the most honest thing on this ship, and you will not break it by refusing what they have offered." Looked down at the small collection of objects in her hands, the star maps, and the warm stone, and the woven bracelet, and the faded ribbon that smelled faintly of sleep and safety, and she felt the weight of them not in her palms, but somewhere deeper, somewhere in the part of her chest where confusion becomes tenderness. "I do not understand," she said quietly. "No," said Sanhara. "But you will." Asha carried the gifts back to her quarters and placed them carefully on the shelf beside her bed where she could see them. And she sat on the edge of her bunk and looked at them for a long time, and wondered what in the world she had done to deserve them. The answer was so simple that it would take her several more days to find it. And when she did, it would change everything. The answer came to Asha the way most important answers come, not through careful thinking, but through accident and patience, and a willingness to sit with a question long enough for it to open on its own. She had been watching the cubs for 2 days, watching them the way they had been watching her, and she had noticed the way they looked at her, the way their ears perked up, and their tails went still when she entered a room, the way they whispered to each other and pointed at her when they thought she could not see, and she had noticed especially the way they looked at her hair when it was wet. It was the hair that unlocked it. She was standing in the corridor after her morning shower, toweling her hair the way she always did, when she caught Risen watching her from behind a support column, and his golden eyes were so full of something enormous and complicated that Asha stopped what she was doing and looked right back at him. The human woman and the small alien boy, staring at each other across a gap that was much wider than the distance between them. "Risen," she said gently, and she crouched down so that she was closer to his height, because she had learned that Marathi cubs felt safer when adults came down to their level. "Can I talk to you?" Risen's fur bristled, and his ears flattened, and for a moment he looked like he might run, but then something in him held firm, some combination of courage and devotion that kept his paws planted on the floor, and he stepped out from behind the column and stood before her with his tail curled tightly around his own leg. "Yes," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "The gifts outside my door," Asha said. "They were from you and the other cubs." It was not a question, but Risen nodded anyway. "Can you tell me why?" she asked. Risen was quiet for a moment, and she could see the struggle in him, the war between the desire to speak and the fear of speaking. And then something tipped, and the words came pouring out of him the way water pours from a broken dam, fast and shaky and impossible to stop. He told her everything. He told her about the night they had seen her walk through the corridor with water streaming from her head, and how they had known immediately that she had been to the deep place where the water lives. And he told her about the Kethvol, the ancient serpents of the river deltas, and how every Marathi child learned their names before they learned their own, and how the stories said that the Kethvol were made of the water itself, that they were the river's hunger given teeth and scales and a terrible patience. He told her that no Marathi had ever gone into the water and come back, not in any story, and not in any history, and not in any memory that anyone carried, and that when they saw her walking calmly with the water on her body and no wounds and no fear in her eyes, that she had done the impossible thing, the thing that every Marathi warrior had failed to do since the beginning of their world. "You fought the water beast," Risen said, and his voice was trembling but certain, the voice of a child who had built his whole understanding of the universe around one shining fact. "You went in and you fought it and you won, and that is why we gave you the tribute, because you are the greatest warrior anyone has ever known." Asha listened to every word, and she did not interrupt, and she did not laugh. And the not laughing was important, because the first thing that rose in her chest when she heard the full story was a laugh. Not a cruel laugh, but the kind of laugh that comes from surprise and absurdity. The laugh of a woman who has just discovered that she has been turned into a mythical hero because she takes showers. But she did not let the laugh out, because she was looking at Risen's face, and she could see what this meant to him, could see the architecture of belief that he had built, and the love that held it together, and the way his small body was trembling with the courage it took to tell her all of this. And she understood that laughing would be the cruelest thing she could do in this moment. So instead, she felt the laugh and let it pass through her, and what was left behind was something softer and more important. She thought about what to do. She could tell him the truth. The plain, simple truth that she had not fought anything. That she had simply stood under warm water and washed her hair the way humans have done every day for thousands of years. And this would be honest and correct, and it would also shatter something precious in this child's heart. Or she could say nothing, and let the legends stand, and let the cubs believe she was a great warrior. And this would preserve their wonder, but it would be built on a lie. And lies always eventually collapse, and the collapse always hurts more than the truth would have. She chose neither of these paths. "Listen," she said, and her voice was steady and warm, and she reached out and placed her hand very gently on his shoulder, and felt the softness of his silver fur beneath her palm. "I did not fight a water beast." His ears dropped, and his tail went limp, and she could feel the tremor that ran through his small body like a wave, and she tightened her hand on his shoulder just slightly, just enough to say, "I am still here, and I am not finished. But I want to show you something," she said. "You and the others, will you come with me?" Rison looked up at her, and his golden eyes were confused and a little bit broken and a lot scared. But underneath all of that there was trust, the simple, enormous trust that children give to the people who have been gentle with them, and he nodded. Getting permission from Sanhara took a conversation that Asha would remember for a long time. To Asha's request, with her ears perfectly still, and her eyes unreadable. And when Asha finished speaking, Sanhara was quiet for nearly a full minute, which is a very long time when someone is staring at you with golden eyes that seem to see through your skin to the bones underneath. "You wish to take the cubs to the observation lounge," Sanhara said. "Yes," said Asha. "And what will you show them there?" "The truth," Asha said, "but the kind version of it." Sanhara studied her for another long moment, and then her ears rotated slowly forward, and her tail uncurled from around her own waist, which meant she had made a decision. "Go," she said, "and be careful with them, Lieutenant. They are small and they believe in you, and belief is the most breakable thing in the universe." "I know," Asha said. She gathered the cubs in the corridor outside the Playnook, all 5 of them, Rison and Porath and Della, and the 2 others whose gifts she now kept on her shelf, and Tavi, who stood at the back of the group, with her ribbonless paw gripping the edge of her tunic. And she led them through the ship to the observation lounge on the upper deck. The lounge was empty at this hour, and the viewport stretched from floor to ceiling, a massive curved window that looked out into the black. And what was waiting outside that window was something that Asha had checked the navigation charts for before coming here, because she wanted the universe to help her say what she needed to say. The ship was passing through the Valon Nebula, and the nebula was threaded with plasma streams that caught the light of distant stars, and glowed in ribbons of blue and silver and pale green. And they moved slowly across the dark, like rivers of light flowing through an ocean of nothing. And they were the most beautiful thing that any of the cubs had ever seen. The cubs pressed against the viewport, and their golden eyes reflected the light. Tall and forward, and for a moment they forgot about warriors and beasts and tributes, and were simply children, looking at something wonderful. "Where I come from," Asha said, and she sat down on the floor beside them, so that they were all at the same level. "Water is not a beast, and it is not an enemy." The cubs turned to look at her. "Humans come from water," she said. "A long time ago, our ancestors lived in it. And even now, when a human baby is growing inside its mother, it floats in water. And when we are born, we come out of the water and into the air. And our first act in this life is to leave the water behind, but we never really leave it, because it is inside us and around us, and we cannot live without it." She paused and looked at their faces, and saw that they were listening with every part of themselves. "We play in it when we are children," she said. "We swim in it, which means we move through it using our arms and legs, and we splash it at each other, laugh, And when we are sad or tired, we stand under it and let it fall on us, and it makes us feel clean and new. And that is what I was doing when you saw me with wet hair. I was standing under water and letting it make me feel new again. Tavi's enormous eyes were shining. I did not fight a water beast, Asha said. There was no battle, and no monster, and no victory, and I am sorry if that is disappointing. The cubs were quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before something important. And then Tavi's small voice rose up from the silence, like a bird taking flight. But you are not afraid, she said. Asha smiled, a real smile, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than the face. No, she said, I was not afraid. Why? Asked Risen, and his voice was not broken anymore, but searching, reaching for something new to replace what had been taken away. Asha thought about this carefully, because it was a real question, and it deserved a real. Because I grew up with water, she said, and when you grow up with something you learn that it is part of you, and not something to fear. And that does not make me brave, Risen. It just makes me different from you. And different is not better. It is just different. And that is okay. The cubs looked at each other, and then they looked back at the nebula, and its rivers of light. And then they looked at Asha, and something was happening in their small golden eyes, something that was not the death of wonder, but its transformation into something more complicated and more true. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way that a garden is quiet when something is growing beneath the soil. Nothing dramatic on the surface, but a deep, slow change happening underneath that would eventually push its way into the light. The cubs did not forget what Asha had told them in the observation lounge, and they did not stop talking about her. But the way they talked about her changed in a way that was hard to describe unless you were a Marathi who understood the difference between worship and respect, between fearing something powerful and choosing to walk towards something unfamiliar. The first sign of change was Tavi. It happened on a Tuesday by Earth reckoning, though the ship's calendar used a different system that Asha had never fully understood. And Asha was in the galley, washing her hands in the basin, the way she did every day, without thinking about it. And she heard a small sound behind her, and turned and found Tavi standing 3 steps away, with her sandy fur slightly puffed, and her amber eyes locked on the running water, with an expression that was halfway between terror and determination. "Can you show me?" Tavi asked, and her voice was so small that it was almost not a voice at all, but more like the idea of a voice, the ghost of a sound that wanted very badly to exist. Asha did not ask what she meant, because she could see it in the way Tavi's eyes moved between the water and Asha's hands, and back to the water again. "Come here," Asha said, and she turned the water down to the thinnest stream it could manage, barely more than a thread of silver falling from the tap into the basin. Tavi took 1 step forward, and then another, and then she was beside Asha, and she was close enough to feel the tiny drops that bounced off the basin's edge, and her fur rippled with each one, but she did not move away. "You do not have to do this," Asha said, because she wanted Tavi to know that bravery was not the same as obligation, and that no one would think less of her if she walked away. "I want to," Tavi said, and there was something in her voice that had not been there before. Something that sounded like the beginning of a decision that would last a lifetime. Asha held her own hand under the stream, and let the water run over her fingers, and Tavi watched with those enormous eyes, and then very slowly, so slowly that it took nearly a full minute, Tavi reached out one small paw. The tip of her claw touched the water. She yanked it back immediately and made a sharp hissing sound, and her fur stood on end all over her body, and her tail puffed up to twice its size, and for a moment she looked like she might bolt from the room. But she did not bolt. She stood there breathing hard, with her paw clutched against her chest, and her golden eyes wide and wild. And then something in her face changed, a shift so subtle that only someone who was watching very carefully would have noticed, caught it, and the fear did not leave her eyes, but something else moved in beside it, something that looked like surprise. "It is warm," she said. "Yes," said Asha. Tavi looked at the stream of water for a long moment, and then she reached out again and touched it with one claw tip. And this time she did not yank her hand back, and the water ran over the very end of her claw and down the curve of her small finger, and dripped off into the basin. And Tavi watched it go with an expression that was so full of wonder and triumph that Asha had to press her lips together to keep from crying. "It is not a beast," Tavi whispered. "No," said Asha, "it is not." Tavi pulled her paw back and held it up in front of her face, and looked at the single drop of water that clung to the tip of her claw like a tiny jewel, and she did not wipe it away. She carried it out of the galley like a trophy. After that, the changes came faster. Porath asked Asia to fill a glass of water and set it on the table so he could look at it up close, and he spent 20 minutes studying it from every angle, with his orange ears pointed straight forward. And when he was done, he said, "It does not have eyes," in a voice of great scientific satisfaction, and Della agreed that this was an important finding. Two of the other cubs asked Asha questions about rain, which was a concept so alien to them that they could barely form the words. And when Asha described water falling from the sky and covering everything, and how humans would sometimes go outside in it just because they liked the way it felt, the cubs looked at her as if she were describing a world made of dreams. Risen did not touch the water, and he did not ask to touch the water, and Asha did not push him because she understood that some journeys are longer than others, and that the eldest often carries the heaviest fear, because they have had more time to learn it. And she knew that Risen would find his own way to the water when he was ready and not before. But Risen was doing something else. He was drawing again. He had erased the old drawing, the one with Asha standing over the dead serpent with her foot on its neck, and he had started a new one. And this time he worked slowly and carefully over many days, and he did not show anyone what he was making until it was finished. When it was finished, he brought it to the War Council and held it up, and the other cubs went silent. The new drawing showed Asha standing in water up to her knees, with her hair loose and wet around her shoulders. And she was not fighting anything, and she was not standing on anything. She was simply standing in the water the way a person stands in a place where they feel at home. And she was smiling, and her hand was stretched out toward the edge of the water, where a small Marathi cub stood on dry ground, with one paw reaching forward. The two hands had not yet touched, but they were close, so close that you could feel the almost of it, the beautiful, impossible almost of two different kinds of courage meeting in the space between fear and trust. "This is the real picture," Risen said. Nobody spoke for a long time, and then Tavi chirped softly and said, "Yes, it is," and that was enough. It was Sonhara who suggested the mural. She had seen the drawing, because cubs are not as secretive as they think they are, and she came to the play nook one evening and looked at it for a long time with her ancient golden eyes, and then she went to the commons wall where the family histories were displayed, the painted stories and carved symbols that told the tale of their people across generations and across stars. And she stood before the wall and placed her palm flat against it in the gesture that meant, "This is sacred ground." "There is space here," she said to the cubs, and she pointed to an empty section of the wall that had been waiting for a new story for longer than any of them had been alive. "Would you like to put your picture here?" The cubs painted the mural together over the course of a week, and they used the bright mineral pigments that the Marathi had carried from their homeworld, colors that would not fade for 100 years. And they painted Asha in the water, and the cub at the edge, and the two hands reaching toward each other. And when it was done, it glowed on the wall like a window into a world where fear was just the first step on the road to something better. It was the first new addition to the family deck's oral history, in 3 generations. Adults came to look at it, and stood before it with their ears forward and their tails still, and some of them asked the cubs what it meant, and the cubs told them, and the story spread through the deck, in the way that all true stories spread, quietly and inevitably, and with the weight of something that needed to be known. Sanhara came to Asha's quarters on the evening after the mural was finished, and she stood in the doorway with her fur smooth and her eyes carrying something that Asha had never seen there before, something deeper than respect and warmer than admiration. "I want to tell you something," Sanhara said. "Please," said Asha. "In our language there is a word, Ketshara, and for as long as anyone can remember, it has meant water warrior, the one who kills the beast of the deep, and it was a word of legend, only because no one had ever earned it, and no one ever would." Sanhara paused, and her tail moved slowly behind her in the motion that meant she was choosing her words with great care. "The cubs have changed it," she said. "They still use the word Kethshara, but it does not mean what it used to mean. It no longer means one who kills the water beast." "What does it mean now?" Asha asked. "It means one who teaches you the water will not kill you," Sanhara said. "Mouth," and then closed it, because there are moments when words are too small for what you are feeling. And this was one of those moments, and she stood there in her doorway, with her eyes stinging, and her throat tight, and her hands at her sides, and she did not know what to say. Sanhara seemed to understand this, because she simply inclined her head in the Marathi gesture of deep respect, and turned and walked away down the corridor, with her tail held high. The next morning, Asha walked through the commons, with her hair still wet from her shower, the way she always did, and the water dripped onto the floor the way it always did. And she passed the mural on the wall, and she passed the play nook, where the cubs were stacking their glowing blocks. Tavi saw her first, and waved with the paw that had touched the water, a quick, bright wave that was nothing like the trembling reverence of before, and everything like the greeting of a child who is happy to see someone she trusts. Risen looked up from his blocks and gave her a nod, a small, serious nod from a cub who had learned that the truth is sometimes better than the legend, because the truth is something you can actually hold. Porath said, "Good morning, Water Warrior," in a cheerful voice, and Della agreed that it was a good morning. Asha smiled at them, and kept walking, and the water dripped from her hair, and the cubs did not flinch, and the ship hummed its engine lullaby, and the mural glowed on the wall, with its 2 hands reaching toward each other across the space between different kinds of brave. And in her chamber, Elder Mother Sanhara sat with her morning tea, and thought about the human who had walked in with wet hair and changed something that 3 generations had not been able to change, and she turned a single thought over in her mind, like a warm stone in her palm. The humans do not conquer the things they are unafraid of, they simply walk through them, and somehow that is enough to make the rest of us believe that we can walk through them too. Outside the viewport, the stars turned slowly in the black, and the verdant cradle carried its passengers forward into the unknown. And somewhere in the commons, a small cub with sandy fur and enormous amber eyes held her paw under a thin stream of water and did not pull away. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.